Good afternoon and welcome to NYFP. In midday trade on this Thursday, U.S. stocks remain lower in negative territory. We did get mixed U.S. economic data releases, and in mid-morning trade, the U.S. House also passed a spending bill to prevent a government shutdown. Joining me now to focus in on Cyprus is Sandra Navidi of BeyondGlobal. Good afternoon, Sandra. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Remy.
Well, the latest update regarding Cyprus is that the Eurogroup will be holding a teleconference today, but a lot has happened in the past few days. So I do want to start out by asking you about the rejection of the tax levy on depositors. What do you make of that rejection? Were you surprised?
It was a stunning response to a good offer. It has to be said that German taxpayers, for instance, are making a contribution of over 2,000 euros per German citizen. So Germany didn't think it was asked too much to ask for somewhat of a contribution from Cyprus. And I have to point out that it was not Germany who insisted on putting the levy on savers, depositors below 100,000 euros. That was Cyprus's own decision because they wanted to preserve the larger fortunes, those of large Russian depositors.
And indeed, there was a lot of criticism when news came out regarding this bailout proposal. But the small island nation has until Monday to come up with funds for this bailout. And the European Central Bank as well as the IMF said that they will be withdrawing the ELA. So where does the nation go from here?
Well, that's why the response was so surprising, because they don't have a whole lot of alternatives. They don't have any negotiation leverage. So what are they going to do? Well, what they can do is they can try and raise the assets on their own. They can try to restructure their banks, which are basically bankrupt. That may not be the worst solution. What it would mean wiping out the debt and equity of the people who have stakes right now, and taking larger parts of the large depositors, those above 100,000, and transforming that into equity. So that would mean it would take a few days, then the banks could reopen, and for people without below 100,000 euros in holdings, it wouldn't have great ramifications. And lastly, what they could do, they could exit the Eurozone, but that would be very hard. Long term, they could recover, but in the meantime, it would be very hard for the population.
And while we're on this topic of Cyprus, I think it's very important to distinguish the nation from other Eurozone countries. So given its status also as a tax haven nation, what else do you think, aside from economic output, makes it different from the other Eurozone nations?
Well, first of all, it's very small. I think it's a 0.2% of the European GDP. Then the large contingent of the deposits from one other nation, namely Russia, that have it's an outsourced business center for Russia. And then the fact that it's very opaque, small and opaque, and that's not something that the Eurozone wants in their midst. Even if Cyprus were to stay in, they would have to change their business model. It's been defunct, it doesn't work, and Europe doesn't want it. We all have to be somewhat on the same page.
And last but not least, Sandra, before we wrap it up for today's interview, when this news came out after the weekend about this tax levy on small depositors as opposed to bondholders, there was some fear regarding bank runs. But do other Eurozone nations have to fear something like this coming up if a potential bailout was proposed?
Well, I think what we could see is a bit of a bank jog. There aren't many alternatives. Banks are utilities. We need banks. Small and medium business owners need to have local banks. In terms of the levy on savings, I think that the perception of people is a little bit that banks and governments are synonymous, and that's a bit understandable because in the last few years banks have stepped in, governments have stepped in for banks, but really what it is, they're private entities. There are state banks, but that's different. They're private entities, and when I give the bank and the bank gives me interest, that's a business transaction, and beyond the amount that is insured, I really have no right. It's my business decision to pick a good institute, and if, like the Cyprus banks, they pay twice as much interest as, for instance, banks in Germany and more, then that should raise suspicions, and it should raise the awareness that probably they're a little bit more risky, because that's what you pay for.
Well, Sandra, we'll have to see what happens with Cyprus in the coming days. So thank you so much for weighing in on this topic.